The Sherman tank groaned to a stop in the bocage country of Normandy. July 1944. Inside its steel belly, 5 British tankers had been sealed tight for nearly 6 hours, breathing a mix of oil fumes, sweat, and the metallic tang of cordite. When the last echo of distant shell fire faded, they finally heard something rare in that place. Silence. No German guns, no ricochets, no screams. Just the hum of flies over the hedgerows and the soft ticking of an engine cooling down. Then, from the commander's seat, came the words every man was waiting for. "Right, lads," he said. "Let's brew up." Those 3 words carried more comfort than any field order. The driver clambered out first, unstrapping a small Primus stove from his kit. Another man grabbed the dented kettle, while the wireless operator fished out the mugs, chipped, mismatched, each marked with initials in fading paint. Someone found the condensed milk, someone else the sugar tin. In a few practiced minutes, the ritual took form. On the Sherman's rear deck, above armor still warm from the engine, the men of Britain's 2nd Fife and Forfar Yeomanry prepared tea. For a brief, fragile 10 minutes, they were no longer cogs in a machine of war. They were just men, tired, thirsty, and desperately clinging to something familiar. Steam curled into the summer air, carrying with it a smell of home. Boiled water, scorched metal, a hint of sweetness. It was the scent of normal life amid chaos. They never saw the panther. Hidden behind a hedgerow 300 meters away, a German gunner lined up his shot. The first armor-piercing round struck the Sherman's flank with a dull, shattering boom. The second hit the fuel tanks. The tank erupted in a fireball. 3 men died instantly. The 2 survivors were pulled from the wreckage with burns across 60% of their bodies. The day's report captured it in one short line. 1 tank, 5 casualties. Crew dismounted for tea. That was all the war diary recorded, but it happened again and again and again. From El Alamein to Normandy, British tank crews had a habit that no amount of orders could break. When the guns fell quiet, they stopped to brew. And more than a few died for it. In North Africa, it had been the same. The desert sun scorched the tanks to the temperature of ovens, the air inside so thick with heat that men's tongues stuck to the roof of their mouths. When a lull came, they'd swing open the hatches, climb out into the sand, and light their little stoves. That thin line of smoke curling into the blue sky was all the enemy needed. German spotters learned quickly. If you saw steam, you saw targets. By late 1943, British intelligence had the statistics in black and white. Tank crews brewing externally spent an average of 12 minutes completely exposed. In those 12 minutes, their awareness dropped to almost nothing. Men focused on kettles, not on periscopes. Their reaction time to enemy contact stretched from 4 seconds, when buttoned up, to 30 seconds when dismounted. In armored warfare, that half-minute gap was the distance between life and death. The Royal Armored Corps began. Calling it the brewer's vulnerability, it was killing men faster than some battles, but try telling a British soldier not to drink tea. You'd have better luck convincing him not to breathe. Tea wasn't just a drink. It was identity, a ritual older than the empire itself. Since the Napoleonic Wars, every soldier in the British Army had carried a tea ration. By 1942, each man received enough for 6 strong brews a day. To them, tea wasn't comfort. It was sanity. When you'd watched your mates burn alive inside a tank, when you'd smelled the bitter stench of cordite and human flesh, those 10 minutes over a kettle were the only moments that reminded you you were still human. The question wasn't whether tankers would stop making tea. They wouldn't. The question was how to keep them alive while doing it. To understand that obsession, you have to go back a generation, to the mud and blood of 1916. During the First World War, British officers discovered something extraordinary. Hot tea delivered to the front lines reduced cases of shell shock by nearly 40%. Doctors noticed that men who received tea regularly stayed calmer under bombardment. The caffeine helped, but the real secret was something else, an amino acid called theanine, which quietly steadied the brain's rhythm. Soldiers who drank tea were alert, focused, and less likely to panic. By 1916, mobile tea wagons followed the troops to the trenches. They called them tea cars, and they were as important to morale as the guns they supported. Men queued for mugs of scalding liquid in the cold rain, hands trembling from fear and fatigue. The ritual, pouring, stirring, sipping, became a tiny act of civilization amid madness. It meant you were still alive. 2 decades later, when the world went to war again, that ritual came with them. By 1939, the War Office classified tea as an essential military supply, right alongside fuel and ammunition. When the British Expeditionary Force crossed into France, every company carried specialized brewing gear. Even at Dunkirk, as men waded through water toward rescue boats, many refused to leave their kettles behind. Sailors hauling them aboard later reported that the first question most soldiers asked wasn't, "Are we safe?" It was, "When's tea?" In the desert, the obsession became survival. Inside a tank, temperatures soared above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Crews lost quarts of sweat every hour. Dehydration dulled reflexes, slowed thought, made mistakes fatal. Doctors learned something surprising. The crews who brewed tea, even hot tea in blistering heat, actually performed better. The tannins in tea helped the body absorb water more effectively than plain water alone. Tea time wasn't just morale, it was medicine. No one understood that better than Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. When he took command of the 8th Army in August 1942, one of his first orders was simple. Every forward unit must carry 3 days' worth of tea, sugar, and condensed milk. When logistics officers objected, Montgomery snapped back, "I can order men to fight without artillery if I must. I cannot order them to fight without tea. They simply won't do it properly." He wasn't joking. A few months later, during the pursuit across Libya, British supply lines broke down. When the tea ran out after 3 days, discipline began to crumble. Men became short-tempered, careless, and reckless. One officer noted bitterly in his diary, "The lads would charge a German position for a packet of cigarettes, but without char, they'll barely clean their weapons." American officers didn't understand. General George S. Patton once grumbled, "The British would rather have tea than ammunition." He meant it as an insult. The British took it as a compliment, because for them, tea was courage in liquid form. The trouble was, that courage was getting men killed. The 22nd Armored Brigade recorded the numbers during Operation Crusader in 1941. Over 17 days of fighting, they lost 43 tanks. 16 of those were hit while crews were dismounted making tea. 37% of their total losses from kettles, not combat. The brigade commander wrote grimly in his report, "We are literally brewing ourselves to death. It happened everywhere." In Tunisia, 1943, the 6th Armored Division logged 29 crew deaths directly linked to tea breaks. In one afternoon, a Churchill company lost 3 tanks in a single salvo. Each crew had stopped to brew. In Italy, the toll was worse. The steep terrain gave German gunners perfect lines of sight. Between September 1943 and May 1944, at least 74 British tanks were destroyed while their crews were stopped for tea. The Canadians fighting beside them adopted the same habit and suffered the same fate. One entry in a Canadian war diary read, "Major Wilson killed with entire crew by mortar fire while preparing afternoon tea. Teapot survived intact." That last line, "Teapot survived intact," said everything about the absurdity of it all. Men turned to ash inside their machines, and yet the porcelain pot sat unharmed in the dirt. Something had to change, and that change would come from an unlikely place. Not a general, not an engineer, but a 28-year-old tank wireless operator named Peter Garrick, recovering in a hospital bed in Southampton. He'd been burned, not by the enemy, but by boiling water from his own Primus stove spilled during a hasty retreat. As he lay there, his hands bandaged, Garrick kept asking himself a question. Why did men have to risk their lives for something so simple? Why couldn't tanks make their own tea? It was a question that would save thousands of lives and quietly change the future of armored warfare. Peter Garrick wasn't a scientist. He wasn't an officer, an engineer, or a man of influence. He was a burned, bandaged wireless operator lying in a British hospital bed in early 1943. One more casualty of the Desert War. The irony was painful. He hadn't been wounded by enemy fire, but by his own kettle. A jolt from the tank's movement had tipped the Primus stove, and the scalding water that was supposed to bring comfort instead seared his hand and arm. Now, with his skin wrapped in gauze and his nights filled with morphine dreams, he kept replaying one thought. It doesn't have to be this way. Every tank already had power. Every tank already produced heat. So why couldn't a tank, a machine designed for war, also provide the one thing British soldiers needed most? Hot water. In his hospital bed, Garrick began to sketch. He drew rough diagrams on the backs of medical forms: wires, heating coils, a metal cylinder. His idea was absurdly simple. Tap into the tank's existing electrical system, divert a small current to heat a vessel, and use that energy to boil water safely inside the vehicle. No open flames. No smoke. No dismounting under enemy eyes. He wrote at the top of the page, "Boiling vessel, electric type, for armored fighting vehicle use." When he was discharged months later, Garrick sent his sketches to the Ministry of Supply. He wasn't expecting fame. He just wanted tankers to stop dying for tea. The reply, when it came, was short and cold. One official scribbled in the margin, "Waste of resources. Tanks are for fighting, not catering." Another officer scrawled something crueler, "Mollycoddling. What next, armored bathrooms?" And with that, the proposal was shelved. The idea might have died right there, buried beneath the paper mountain of British bureaucracy, if it hadn't landed on the desk of Major Anthony Norman, an officer in the Directorate of Tank Design. Norman wasn't a typical bureaucrat. He'd served in North Africa, and he knew what a brewing stop really meant. He'd seen a tank vanish in flame because his crew decided to make tea under the open sun. He'd lost half his men to that ritual. When he read Garrick's sketches, Norman didn't see mollycoddling. He saw survival. He pushed the idea upward, refusing to let it die in the paperwork. Weeks later, it reached the engineers at the Fighting Vehicle Proving Establishment in Chobham, who decided to give it a chance. By August 1943, they had a working prototype, a small stainless steel cylinder about the size of a large thermos, wired directly to a 24-volt circuit. The engineers flipped the switch. The indicator light came on. For 2 minutes, the water began to tremble and hiss. Then the vessel exploded. Boiling water sprayed across the turret. 2 test crewmen were scalded. The test was an absolute disaster. But in its failure, the engineers saw proof that the idea had potential. It just needed refining. The months that followed were a war within a war, fought not with guns, but with soldering irons, metal tubing, and trial after painful trial. The team at Chobham, led by Captain Ronald Hazelden, discovered that making a reliable electric kettle for a tank was far harder than it sounded. It needed to survive shock waves from firing. It needed to work at 20 degrees in Russia and 120 degrees in the desert. It needed to draw minimal power and never, under any circumstance, short out the tank's electrical systems. 43 prototypes later, they had it. A double-walled vessel with vacuum insulation, copper heating coils, a thermostat, and a pressure relief valve, all crammed into a canister barely 9 inches tall. The design could boil 1 quart of water, enough for 6 mugs, in under 4 minutes. They called it simply the boiling vessel. During the first successful test, the water inside bubbled exactly as it should. No leaks, no explosions, just the quiet, steady hum of electricity doing its job. The engineers stood around in silence, then broke into cheers. In May 1944, they declared it ready for combat. The first units to receive the device were Sherman and Churchill tanks of the British Army in Normandy. The installation was simple: 2 brackets on the turret wall, a wire to the main power bus, and a toggle switch marked BV on-off. The first field test came a week after D-Day. A tank crew from the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry brewed tea while sitting in a hedgerow outside Caen. For the first time in the war, no one had to climb out, light a stove, or risk drawing fire. They flipped a switch, waited 4 minutes, and poured steaming water into their mugs, all while buttoned up and ready to move at a moment's notice. That night, the commander wrote in his logbook, "We've brewed up 40 times this week. Tea, that is, not the other kind. Not once did we expose ourselves outside the tank. Jerry doesn't know when we're vulnerable anymore because we never are." He didn't realize it, but his tank had just entered the future. The BV wasn't glamorous. It didn't fire shells or add horsepower. It was a box that made hot water. But in a matter of months, it would quietly change everything about how British tankers lived, fought, and survived. The Royal Armoured Corps began collecting data immediately. They compared units equipped with the boiling vessel to those still using traditional brewing methods. Over 6 weeks of combat in Normandy, the results were staggering. Tanks fitted with BVs saw a 42% drop in casualties during rest periods. Incidents of tanks being caught stationary fell by 2/3. The 3rd Hussars, a regiment that had lost 9 tanks to ambush while making tea in June and July, reported 0 such losses after installing the BV in August. Not fewer, none. Their commanding officer summed it up bluntly. "We still drink just as much tea. We simply don't die for it anymore." By the fall of 1944, word spread like wildfire. Mechanics began installing BVs wherever they could. Commanders began requesting them by name. The War Office, once skeptical, was suddenly flooded with praise reports. Even medical officers noticed something extraordinary. Crews equipped with BVs weren't just safer, they were healthier. Tank interiors were cold, cramped and often damp. In winter, temperatures dropped below freezing. Before the BV, men had to choose between freezing in silence or climbing out to heat water, a choice that killed both ways. Now, for the first time, they could make hot tea without leaving their armor. Reports from Holland and Belgium that winter showed 31% fewer cases of frostbite and hypothermia among BV-equipped crews. Psychiatrists studying battle fatigue, what we'd now call PTSD, began noticing patterns too. Crews who could brew inside their tanks displayed better emotional stability, faster recovery from combat stress, and a stronger sense of control. One study from the Royal Army Medical Corps surveyed over 300 tankers. When asked how they felt about the BV, most didn't talk about comfort. They talked about control. "We can make tea when we choose," one gunner said. "Not when the war allows us." That sense of autonomy, the ability to carve out small pockets of humanity in a world gone mad and mattered more than any engineer could have imagined. There were tactical advantages too, the kind only soldiers understood. Before the BV, crews split up during brewing stops, some outside, some inside. Those moments of separation, minor as they seemed, eroded teamwork. The BV changed that. Crews stayed together, brewing and drinking as one. It turned tea time from a safety risk into a bonding ritual. A chaplain attached to the 2nd Fife and 4 Yeomanry wrote in his journal, "The men joke they've gone from dying for a cuppa to living for one. Morale has never been higher." By October 1944, data confirmed what everyone already knew. Across 17 regiments, BV-equipped units suffered 89% fewer tea-related casualties than those without. The War Office issued a new order: all British armored vehicles to be fitted with boiling vessels immediately. Factories at Leyland and Vauxhall began installing them on the production line. The same officers who once mocked the idea now called it essential combat equipment. It wasn't about tea anymore. It was about survival endurance and keeping soldiers human in the least human conditions imaginable. One lieutenant from the Northamptonshire Yeomanry summed it up best in his diary, after a long day holding position near Nijmegen. "We sat in ambush for 11 hours yesterday. Made tea 4 times. Never broke concealment. Before the BV, an hour was our limit before someone absolutely had to brew. This changes everything about how we fight." He wasn't exaggerating. The kettle had become a weapon of war. The change was invisible to outsiders. There were no grand speeches, no medals, no fanfare. But within the British armored divisions, a quiet revolution had taken place, one that would alter doctrine, logistics, even psychology. Because for the first time in modern warfare, a fighting machine didn't just kill better, it kept its crew alive better, and that, in the brutal logic of war, was a revolution far greater than any gun upgrade or armor plate. By the winter of 1944, the British Army had learned something the hard way, that survival didn't just depend on firepower or armor thickness or even bravery. It depended on the small things: a warm drink in frozen hands, a moment of calm before the next shell. And now, thanks to a stainless steel vessel wired into every tank, British crews could have that moment without dying for it. The boiling vessel, the BV, had gone from joke to legend, but the War Office didn't yet realize what they had created. They thought they'd simply solved a morale problem. They hadn't. They'd quietly rewritten how armies would fight and survive for the next 80 years. The numbers don't lie by. October 1944. The Directorate of Armored Fighting Vehicles compiled data from 17 armored regiments operating across Northwest Europe. Before the BV, the average unit suffered nearly 4 casualties a week during non-combat activities, almost all of them related to external brewing stops. After the BV was installed, that number dropped to less than half a casualty per week, an 89% reduction. Extrapolated across the British Army's entire armored force, that meant nearly 300 men every month were staying alive simply because they could brew inside their tanks. The evidence became undeniable. The BV wasn't a comfort, it was a combat multiplier, the tactical shift. The kettle changed how commanders planned battles. Before, armored doctrine required mandatory rest and brew periods every few hours. Not for the tanks, the engines could run for days, but for the men inside them. Human limits, not mechanical ones, dictated operations. Now those limits vanished. Tank units could hold positions longer, sustain pursuits, and launch surprise offensives at odd hours when the enemy least expected them. A division that used to pause 3 or 4 times a day to brew could now push forward, uninterrupted. During the September 1944 advance through Belgium, the British 11th Armored Division covered 250 miles in 6 days, a pace no pre-BV force could have managed. Their after-action report credited the device directly. Crews remained alert throughout rapid advances. The ability to brew whilst moving or during brief halts eliminated the need for extended rest stops. We maintained pursuit momentum that previous armored forces could not sustain. It sounded absurd, but it was true. The kettle had become a weapon of endurance. The night turns friendly. The BV also unlocked something the British had long struggled with, the night. Before its invention, making tea after dark was a gamble. The Primus stoves used before the BV needed flame, and flame meant death. Even a small glow could reveal a tank's position to German patrols. The smell of burning paraffin carried for hundreds of yards in still night air. Crews went cold and thirsty rather than risk exposure. But the boiling vessel had no flame, no smoke, no smell. Just the faint hum of current through copper wire. That silence changed everything. Units that had once dreaded the long, freezing waits of nighttime ambush could now stay alert, fed, hydrated, and quietly sustained. The British 7th Armored Division reported a 43% increase in successful night operations after BV installation. The enemy no longer had the advantage of exhaustion. The hidden advantage. Efficiency. There was another unexpected gain, fuel efficiency. Before the BV, tankers often left engines idling during rest periods, just to keep warm or power heaters for boiling water. Idling consumed about a gallon of petrol every hour. Multiply that by hundreds of tanks, and the cost was staggering. With the BV drawing only a whisper of power, roughly a third of a kilowatt-hour per brew, crews could finally shut engines down completely during halts. The 3rd Royal Tank Regiment calculated they saved 8% of total fuel in a single campaign, simply by brewing electrically. For logistics officers fighting to keep fuel convoys alive across enemy territory, that savings was gold, smoke and shadows. The old tea stoves didn't just waste fuel, they gave away lives. Smoke from small flames might seem harmless, but at dawn or dusk it clung to the ground like a signal flare. German reconnaissance planes and spotters quickly learned to look for it. Many an ambushed squadron had been betrayed by the thin gray column rising from its own kettle. The BV ended that risk forever. No flame, no smoke, no scent. Reconnaissance units, which relied on stealth and long observation, found themselves suddenly able to stay in one position for hours, even days, without compromising cover. A report from the Inns of Court Regiment noted, "Our observation posts now last 3 times longer. No telltale smoke, no smell of paraffin. Enemy has no clue we're there until we move." A kettle had turned invisibility into a tactic. More than tea. The psychology of control. But the real secret wasn't the tea. It was the choice. For the first time, tankers could control one small piece of their environment in a world where they controlled nothing else. They couldn't decide when to fight, or where to die, or which orders to follow, but they could decide when to make tea. That tiny sliver of autonomy had an outsized effect on mental health. A Royal Army Medical Corps study in late 1944 surveyed over 340 armored crewmen. Those with BVs reported lower anxiety, fewer panic symptoms, and higher overall morale. Psychiatrists noticed it immediately. The kettle gave soldiers back a sense of agency. When you can brew a cup of tea inside a machine designed to kill, you remember you're still a person. From comfort to combat doctrine, by early 1945, every new British tank rolling off the line came equipped with a BV as standard. Leyland and Vauxhall factories installed them in Churchill's, Cromwell's, and the new Comet tanks. Training manuals were updated too. The new standing order read, "Crew sustenance systems are to be maintained as combat essential equipment. Boiling vessel to be tested daily." Something that had once been mocked as mollycoddling was now written into official doctrine. And it didn't stop there. Field commanders began using the BV for tactical deception. German intelligence had long relied on spotting brewing stops as indicators of British rest positions. When that pattern disappeared, they became disoriented. So the British began exploiting it. They'd park tanks in visible positions, pretending to be vulnerable, smoke-free, silent, motionless. The Germans, conditioned to expect dismounted crews, would attack. The British would be waiting, buttoned up and ready. In October 1944, near Venlo in the Netherlands, the 15th 319th King's Royal Hussars used exactly that trick, drawing German armor into a trap that destroyed an entire panzer platoon. The report ended with one dry line. Enemy appears confused. They expected tea, received fire. The war ends, but the BV marches. On when the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the BV had earned its place in legend, not with glory, but with quiet necessity. The British Army entered peacetime with the boiling vessel written into every armored vehicle specification. Crews refused to accept any tank without one. Mechanics treated it like sacred equipment, and soon the world noticed. The copycats, the first to adopt, were the Canadians. Having fought beside the British and witnessed the BV's impact firsthand, the Canadian Army made it standard by 1947. Then came the Australians, followed by the New Zealanders. Across the Atlantic, the Americans resisted. Pride, perhaps. General Patton's ghost still haunted their doctrine. To U.S. commanders, comfort was weakness. Their tankers drank instant coffee, cold and bitter, from tin cups balanced on hot engine blocks. But data has a way of crushing pride. During the Korean War, American tank crews began suffering alarming rates of frostbite, dehydration, and fatigue. British Commonwealth crews operating in the same brutal conditions fared far better. The only major difference? The kettle. By 1954, the U.S. Army quietly began fitting its new M48 Patton tanks with crew comfort heating systems. They refused to call them kettles, but the design was unmistakably similar. A stainless vessel with an electric heating element, mounted near the radio operator's seat. The kettle had crossed the Atlantic. Even the Soviets boiled in. The irony of the Cold War was rich. In 1953, Soviet engineers inspecting captured British tanks discovered the BV and immediately copied it. Their version, the KIP-5 individual nutrition kit, was nearly identical in design, right down to the copper heating coil. Communist tankers now brewed tea using capitalist technology. The world had reached an unspoken truce on one point. Soldiers fight better when they can make a hot drink. By the 1960s, nearly every major armored vehicle on Earth carried some form of the BV. It became the quiet common denominator of modern war, proof that no matter the flag or ideology, the men inside those machines were all just human beings trying to stay warm and alive. From steel to silicon, technology moved on, but the principle stayed. Modern main battle tanks, British Challenger 2s, American M1 Abrams, German Leopard 2s, French Leclercs all carry advanced boiling vessels, now capable of heating both water and rations simultaneously. Some use microwave induction instead of resistance coils, boiling a quart in under a minute. Others connect directly to auxiliary power units, working even when the main engine is off. The modern BV even cleans itself automatically, preventing limescale that tankers once scrubbed out with vinegar. Touchscreen controls have replaced toggle switches. Some can even regulate water temperature for coffee, soup, or sterilization. Yet in essence, it's still the same idea Peter Garrick sketched in his hospital bed. A safe way to make hot water in a tank. And across every army, Every creed, every front that idea has endured. Legacy today. NATO standards literally require it. The Alliance's engineering manual includes a line that would have made Garrick smile. Crew sustainment systems, including integrated water heating, shall be considered mission essential. What began as a waste of resources is now written in global doctrine. British. Soldiers still call it by its old nickname, WWII, with a kind of affection reserved for things that saved lives. Every new recruit learns how to maintain it before they ever fire the gun, because the veterans taught them. You can't fight like a machine if you forget you're human. The man behind the machine is, for Peter Garrick, the man who imagined it all. He never asked for recognition. He left the army after the war, went back to working as an electrical fitter, and never patented his design. When asked about it later in life, he shrugged. It just made sense, he said. He died in 1989, having lived long enough to see his creation installed in tanks from Moscow to Missouri. He never received a medal, never saw his name in the manuals, but he didn't need to. His invention spoke for itself, quietly, reliably. Every time a soldier somewhere in the world poured boiling water into a mug and remembered home. Epilogue, the humanity, inside the machine walk into any tank today, British, American, Russian, or otherwise. And you'll find it tucked away in the corner, a small metal cylinder humming faintly. It doesn't look like history. It doesn't look like something that changed the world, but it did.